complacent display of the white feather. The truth is that a certain flexible sympathy with eccentrics of this kind is rather one of the advantages of an aristocratic tradition. The imprisonment of Mr. Debs, the American pacifist, which really was prolonged and oppressive, would probably have been shortened in England, where his opinions were shared by aristocrats like Mr. Bertrand Russell and Mr. Ponsonby. A man like Lord Hugh Cecil would be moved to the defence of conscientious objectors, partly by a true instinct of chivalry, but partly also by the general feeling that a gentleman may very probably have aunts and uncles who are quite as mad. He takes the matter personally, in the sense of being able to imagine the psychology of the persons. But the democracy is no respecter of persons. It is no respecter of them either in the bad and servile or in the good and sympathetic sense. And Debs was nothing to the democracy. He was but one of the millions. This is a real problem or question in the balance, touching different forms of government, which is, of course, quite neglected by the idealists who merely repeat long words. There was during the war a society called the Union of Democratic Control, which would have been instantly destroyed anywhere where democracy had any control or where there was any union. And in this sense the United States have most emphatically got a union. Nevertheless, I think there is something rather more subtle than this simple popular solidity behind the assimilation of American citizens to each other. There is something even in the individual ideal that drives towards this social sympathy. And it is here that we have to remember that biological fancies like the herd instinct are only figures of speech, and cannot really cover anything human. For the Americans are in some ways a very self-conscious people. To compare their social enthusiasm to a stampede of cattle is to ask us to believe in a bull writing a diary or a cow looking in a looking-glass. Intensely sensitive by their very vitality, they are certainly conscious of criticism, and not merely of a blind and brutal appetite. But the peculiar point about them is that it is this very vividness in the self that often produces the similarity. It may be that when they are unconscious they are like bulls and cows, but it is when they are self-conscious that they are like each other. Individualism is the death of individuality. It is so, if only because it is an ism. Many Americans become almost impersonal in their worship of personality. Where their natural selves might differ, their ideal selves tend to be the same. Anybody can see what I mean in those strong self-conscious photographs of American businessmen that can be seen in any American magazine. Each may conceive himself to be a solitary Napoleon brooding at St. Helena, but the result is a multitude of Napoleons brooding all over the place. Each of them must have the eyes of a mesmerist, but the most weak-minded person cannot be mesmerized by more than one millionaire at a time. Each of the millionaires must thrust forward his jaw, offering, if I may say so, to fight the world with the same weapons as Samson. Each of them must accentuate the length of his chin, especially, of course, by always being completely clean-shaven. It would be obviously inconsistent with personality to prefer to wear a beard. These are, of course, fantastic examples on the fringe of American life, but they do stand for a certain assimilation, not through brute gregariousness, but rather through isolated dreaming. And though it is not always carried so far as this, I do not think it is carried too far. There is not quite enough unconsciousness to produce real individuality. There is a sort of worship of will power in the abstract, so that people are actually thinking about how they can will more than about what they want. To this I do think a certain corrective could be found in the nature of English eccentricity. Every man in his humour is most interesting when he is unconscious of his humour, or at least when he is in an intermediate stage between humour in the old sense of oddity and in the new sense of irony. Much is said in these days against negative morality, and certainly most Americans would show a positive preference for positive morality. The virtues they venerate collectively are very active virtues: cheerfulness and courage and vim, otherwise zip, also pep, and similar things. But it is sometimes forgotten that negative morality is freer than positive morality. Negative morality is a net of a larger and more open pattern, of which the lines or cords constrict at longer intervals. A man like Dr. Johnson could grow in his own way to his own stature in the net of the 10 Commandments, precisely because he was convinced that there were only 10 of them. He was not compressed into the mould of positive beauty like that of the Apollo Belvedere or the American Citizen. This criticism is sometimes true even of the American woman, who is certainly a much more delightful person than the mesmeric millionaire with his shaven jaw. Interviewers in the United States perpetually asked me what I thought of American women, and I confessed a distaste for such generalizations which I have not managed to lose. The Americans, who are the most chivalrous people in the world, may perhaps understand me, but I can never help feeling that there is something polygamous about talking of women in the plural at all, something unworthy of any American except a Mormon. Nevertheless, I think the exaggeration I suggest does extend in a less degree to American women, fascinating as they are. I think they too tend too much to this cult of impersonal personality. It is a description easy to exaggerate even by the faintest emphasis, for all these things are subtle and subject to striking individual exceptions. To complain of people for being brave and bright, and kind and intelligent, may not unreasonably appear unreasonable. And yet there is something in the background that can only be expressed by a symbol, something that is not shallowness but a neglect of the subconsciousness and the vaguer and slower impulses, something that can be missed amid all that laughter and light under those starry candelabra of the ideals of the happy virtues. Sometimes it came over me in a wordless wave that I should like to see a sulky woman, how she would walk in beauty like the night and reveal more silent spaces full of older stars. These things cannot be conveyed in their delicate proportion, even in the most detached description. But the same thing was in the mind of a white-bearded old man I met in New York, an Irish exile and a wonderful talker, who stared up at the tower of gilded galleries of the great hotel, and said with that spontaneous movement of style which is hardly heard except from Irish talkers, "And I have been in a village in the mountains where the people could hardly read or write, but all the men were like soldiers, and all the women had pride." The end of section 21.